We're here with composer Ben Hjertmann, and
Hello.
I think he's visible. We're going to double check before we get too heavily into this.
While we're checking, we are here in New York City at the D'Addario New York City showroom in Midtown. This is where New Thread Quartet rehearses. It's where all the magic happens.
Yeah, the lab.
The lab.
Well, how about I make sure that we manually jump around for now? So, we should be seeing whatever's on our screen. So, Ben should be up there. Ben, why don't you say hi and talk a little bit about yourself? Where you're as a
Hello.
composer.
Yeah, I'm Ben Hjertmann. I'm originally from rural Illinois. I lived in Chicago for the last 7 years and have just moved to Boone, North Carolina. You can see the glorious woods of North Carolina over here behind me. Um, and I'm very happy to be here with New Thread Quartet and talking about this brand new piece, Sunstruck.
Cool. So, Sunstruck is a commission that we've been working on with Ben, and it's funded through a project grant with New Music USA. And originally we talked about sort of like an entirely different compositional idea that Ben was working on, and then as he was working on it, as composers do, it kind of grew and changed into what's now called Sunstruck. The piece is 30 minutes long and is sort of in these smaller sections that have maybe 7 larger parts with them. There's lots of very held out microtonal sounds. He has specified vibrato, jaw or diaphragm vibrato, and really neat titles of sections like A Planet Filled with Gods. Things a little bit more interesting than Adagio. And the piece is called Sunstruck, which is a reference to the 19th tarot trump card, which is called the Sun. And we actually brought the card in
Oh,
so you
cool.
can see. Yes.
Yours is slightly different than mine.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead, while you are holding it up, I can read the
Oh yeah.
description
Go for it.
of what the card is. So in traditional tarot, Waite, A.E. Waite is sort of seen as the authority on tarot. And he suggested that this card is associated with attained knowledge. An infant rides a white horse under the anthropomorphized sun with sunflowers in the background. The child of life holds a red flag representing the blood of renewal, while a smiling sun shines down on him, representing accomplishment. The conscious mind prevails over the fears and illusions of the unconscious. Innocence is renewed through discovery, bringing hope for the future. So, Ben, how did you come to relate this piece to the sun card?
Yeah, my interest in the tarot is pretty recent. I've had several friends who were into it for years, and it had been around, and I knew about it, but didn't really get into it until I would say 6 months ago or so, and kind of all of a sudden I got very interested in this realm. Especially, we think about, are people seeing my screen right now? Uh,
They're not. I'll switch it over.
okay.
You're so good
Um,
at this.
Thank you.
All right, you're live.
Um, uh, I was just saying, people think of the tarot as being sort of a device to tell the future, and I didn't really have any interest in that aspect of it. I was more interested in these archetypes, these kind of the 21 trumps are all sort of characters, kind of extremes. The totally creative person and the completely passive person, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these kind of uh, interesting archetypes that might relate to people's personalities or kind of times in life. And I got really, really interested in these, kind of similar to Jungian archetypes or like Myers-Briggs personality types or something. So the Sun card is the 19th trump, which at least in the kind of mythology that I was following, the the 21 trumps are seen as kind of a progression of enlightenment from the sort of purely creative magician, which is the first one, all the way through the last card, which is the world, and it's supposed to be complete kind of unity with everything. And this 19th card is pretty far along. It's kind of a really it's a release. It's kind of, as you say, it's an innocence, and it has to do with this character is sort of rediscovering the freedom of youth, and so that's kind of the part of this that relates to this piece, in that compositionally I felt like this. I really wanted to sort of push my creative efforts really far in one direction, and that specifically would be sort of like compositional freedom. And luckily, I'm getting to work with a group that's really open to that. Think about all the rules that we learn for harmony and rhythm and melody and form and all of these things, and rules that have kind of governed music for hundreds, even 1,000 years at least, that tell us about how we hear it and how it makes sense, etc. And my goal wasn't really to throw all these out the window, but more like see through them freely. And the card is kind of about this revelation of just complete joy and freedom with no explanations and no answers. And that's the kind of what we get in this piece, Sunstruck, is a lot of sound and not much explanation. Maybe I'll pause for a second and see if you guys want to jump back in.
Yeah. You guys have any responses to that? Certainly a lot of sound.
Yeah, it's interesting how you have a lot of microtones and this quarter tones, demi-tones, and things like that, and it provides, I don't know, for me, it provides a lot of suspension, just in general. And then there's these moments of absolute release where there is a sound that I would kind of equate to maybe a clarity.
What's that?
I kind of equate those moments when you're not as suspended, you come away from some of those microtones that you use as
Mm-hmm.
clarity in the piece. And so when I'm thinking of the idea of what the 19th card represents for me, that's kind of what I'm envisioning.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Now we're just like almost 15 minutes in case someone's joining in. Just sort of a quick recap. So we are a new thread quartet, or sax quartet based in New York City, and we're in our rehearsal space, the Dario's showroom. And right now we're having a talk with composer Ben Hjertmann about his new piece, Sunstruck, which we recently commissioned and is funded with the help of New Music USA project grant. Ben, is there something you want to bring up?
Not specifically, but I liked what Kristen was saying about this release. And indeed, there are kind of lots of these moments in this where we get sort of something very unexpected, just sort of the clouds parting and the sun blasts through. Yeah, I can ramble on this all day. But I think that I think sort of the general topic of the piece, if there is one for me, was what happens when I take away the restrictions that I was taught. The rules of writing. What's still left there? Does it make sense to me? Does it make sense to anybody else? And is sense what it's about? And so, these are kind of big questions of music, of course, that have different answers in different contexts. But they were kind of the questions that were flying along on the newsreel in my head as I was sitting at the piano in Chicago, and then in Mexico, and then in North Carolina as I wrote this piece for you guys.
Cool.
Actually, I have a question, and we talked about it in rehearsal last week. I have a question about section C.
Talk out a little bit.
Sorry, I can't hear it.
Just touch on. You got it.
So section C, you title or indicate the word listening in that
Hmm.
Um, could you maybe enlighten us as to what was going through your mind when you titled that section and when you composed that section?
Yeah. Well, I will divulge that my mental state while writing this was not constant. Was not consistent, and that largely had to do with kind of going through some a lot of changes in my life. I had just found out that I was leaving Chicago to come here to teach um, in North Carolina. And so I was kind of uprooted. And the day that I found out about that was the same day that I left for an artist residency in Mexico. And normally you go to these artist residencies to kind of get away from the slog of normal life and go be alone and concentrate and hear the muse speak to you. But in this case, I had just not only left temporarily, but found out that I was going to be leaving permanently from my home in Chicago. So basically, my mental state was just kind of constantly changing, and each of these sections, the way this piece was written, was sort of serially in the. I don't mean that with a capital S, but in that each section, it was kind of written in series. Just the first section is the first one I wrote, the second one is the second one I wrote, and so the titles don't really form any kind of logical progression, but they do relate, to the sections themselves. And this letter C, where it says listening, was just more of a description of what I was doing. I felt like these sustained chords, and maybe we can hear one of those from you guys in a minute. These sustained chords where I was playing them at the piano and just trying to listen to what my intuition, to where it wanted to go. And so by putting that as a marking for you guys, I thought it might be interesting to kind of have that reinterpreted as by the performers as that maybe you guys would also listen. You're already listening to each other all the time, but that in this section there's a pause right before it, and that you would kind of restart even listening even harder to everyone else in the group.
Because that's exactly what Zach was thinking, I think, when we were in rehearsal last week about listening to each other.
Yeah, that one section C that says listening, we sort of focused on with this idea of like really enjoying the sounds, almost as if it's improvised, and you're having to pay attention and feedback like that. So we had a comment from the stream that we're a little bit soft when we're talking,
okay.
So we can talk loudly, and we encourage everyone who's listening to reach out to us, New Thread Quartet at Facebook, and on Twitter at New Thread QTET, QTET, and let us know how the stream is going, if there's anything we can do to make it sound better, or if you have any questions or comments, and we're gonna get to those shortly. We'd love to have you involved. We'll also play a little bit, probably around 6:30. Maybe we'll do that. Ben, let's talk a little bit more about the listening thing, and I think you started to harp on this idea of intuition, which was part of a blurb you initially sent us.
Mm-hmm.
You described Sunstruck as focused on intuition, and then you mentioned how the piece is composed freely at the piano in its entirety, and then you did an editing process, but you really wanted to preserve that initial structure that just sort of comes intuitively. And I know that's probably a different way of composing than you're used to, so maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I think that intuition is, of course, something that all musicians are doing all the time as they create music, and composers are always being intuitive. One of my composition teachers somewhere along the way said something like, "Intuition is not worth talking about because all it is a synthesis in the moment of everything you've ever learned. So take all those rules and all the knowledge that you have about music, and when you're being intuitive at the piano in this case, that all of that's just being synthesized in the moment, so there's no point in talking about it." Although the question is, how much are you guiding what you're doing? I think that's kind of more what this comes down to for me as a composer, is that as I was sitting there at the piano with this piece, my goal was that I guess I didn't have a goal, that that I was trying to allow anything that came to be allowed in the piece. And for those who will be at the premiere, you'll definitely hear this element, because things, as I say, the clouds kind of just part at moments. and you get something completely different that just came to me then. Um, I should correct though that I didn't write the entire piece in one sitting. I did, take breaks, some days or even a week or so, but then I would kind of continue. What Zach was saying about the structure is that um, I wrote basically these simple sustained harmonies mostly, and then some more active stuff. That the point was that I preserved that I didn't want to. I wanted to edit the piece without really changing the exact uh, layout of the piece, you might say, or the form of the piece. So I went basically back in and just added and changed a few notes and added some things over the top, but I wanted to preserve that kind of initial, I guess you might call it improvisation, or initial intuitive blast of stuff. Did that answer your question, Zach, or was there actually
Yeah,
more
yeah.
to
I
it?
was just thinking that. I mean, that seems really scary as a composer to like restrict your ability to go back and edit in that way. And is that something that you did intentionally when you started creating the piece, or was it something you decided like a portion of the way into it?
Yeah, that was my challenge to myself. I'm not sure I'm not sure I really adhered to that 100%, but I kept it as close as I felt like I could. And scary, yeah, that's kind of an interesting element of it, this sort of fear. And all along there was kind of this question of, I have no way to prove that this will be any good. I have no structure to call this worthy. And that kind of comes back to our chat about this sun card um, that that it's just a complete kind of freedom that couldn't really be explained. And I think it's anyone's guess, it's anyone's opinion whether this does work or not. I'm very curious to see what the audience's reactions will be. But as you say, it is very different for me than normal.
Right. Maybe it'd be fun to grab one or two submitted questions, and then we'll play after a little bit of that. I saw one on Twitter.
There's one about that's more about new thread and our musical selection and our musical choices in general. The question is from Holly Nadell. If we've ever tried adapting vocal music to a saxophone quartet, and presently,
Actually, yes, we have.
yeah.
We have a New York-based composer named Anthony Gatto wrote a piece for us entitled Wise Blood, and it's actually meant to be a larger opera. What we wrote it for was a soprano, saxophone quartet, and brass. So that was our first foray into vocal music plus quartet. So we have done a little bit of work with vocal music, and we learned a lot in that process. And we hope to do more work with vocalists in the future. It's really interesting because as wind players, to be playing an instrument that relies so heavily on wind, vocal techniques, anything from vibrato to flutters to rolls, things like that. I think it's really it really expands our palette to be able to play with vocalists and to learn from them. So thanks for that question, Holly. Hope that answers it.
It's actually kind of a neat topic because Ben does a lot of singing in a couple indie rock bands, I guess. I mean, you have a CD out called Angel's Ward, or maybe that's a project name, and you have another group called Kong Must Dead, and you play in a band called Grant Wallace Band, and you sing in all of that. And when I first met Ben, it was at Bang in a Can Summer Festival last year, and the piece that you wrote for the festival to perform was actually you as lead singer with sort of a backup band of chamber music covering all sorts of different genres that just sort of snapped into each one. And I hope we really need to have you talk about that part of your life and how that interacts with your composition, or if it doesn't.
Yeah, sure. I am definitely a vocalist when I perform, and that's how I first got into music. Well, I played guitar as a kid and played in grunge bands and things, but then I was working the spotlights for a musical, and they needed somebody else to come down and sing a part. And so I got into musicals, and I sang Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar. And then that kind of got me into wanting to compose a musical, which I did in high school, and I want to do that again, by the way. And then it was my high school one was terrible, by the way. But that got me into music, and actually I kind of came into composition because I just got really obsessed with chords, and I got really interested in harmony, and wanted to learn about orchestration and all these things, and so I got into that. And then I took a long time off from singing, really, to kind of try to catch up on what classical music was, and then sort of came back to singing in grad school. And the Grant Wallace Band, of those projects that you mentioned, is the most stable and permanent. That the Grant Wallace Band is myself and Luke Gullickson and Chris Fisher-Lockhead, who are also composers. And that's an interesting group because we really get to write the music together. We were just in New York a couple weeks ago at the Resonant Bodies Festival performing, and we all sing in the group, and it's a type of composing that's really different from my other composing, because we sort of bring in scraps, and then as a group we edit them. Someone will take home your music and fix it up and finish it. You'll kind of do an arrangement of someone else in the group, so it's really a collaborative process. And the voice is really kind of a line in the sand in my style, in that I really feel like with words, with some kind of text, that it makes the story of a piece fact, and it doesn't need explanation. And so it is kind of very different for me to be writing with a voice. Had we added a voice, for example, to this piece, it would have completely changed the style of the piece. The harmony would be completely different, not just to help the vocalist, but because I think that that's just kind of it's a very different process for me to write with text than for what we might say absolute music, or just instruments making sound. And in a way, I think of this process, what I've done with you guys and what I do with chamber groups, as a little bit more pure somehow, you might say, or it's just a little bit closer to music for music's sake, whatever that means. And there isn't really a story for this piece. There are titles to the sections, but there isn't a story other than everything that I was going through while writing it. I don't know.
Question. Speak a little louder. I have a question about the last section. Speaking of pop music, you've titled this section "Aeroplane Over the Mid-90s," and I am a huge Neutral Milk Hotel fan.
Aha, you caught it.
I was
Okay.
just wondering if that was referencing them.
It is, but I will admit that the music is not at all related. I mean, there's kind of a progression of these. The group keeps bringing up these titles. You won't be able to see this probably, but over the music next to the tempo, I have these kind of titles for the sections, and there is kind of a progression of them getting less and less relevant to what you're playing, or more and more of a question, I might say, that as you're supposed to interpret this music, how does this mid-90s thing relate to what you're playing? And I think this is, by this section in the piece, it's very much just creative and up to your interpretation. I'm sorry if that sounds like a cop-out, but I also love Neutral Milk Hotel, Kristen, and I'm glad that you caught the reference there. But yeah, you won't be able to hear any relation to Jeff Mangum's music there.
So Ben, one big issue that we've had to deal with as interpreters is all the different types of vibrato that you've included, and from diaphragm vibrato of all varying speeds to jaw vibrato to what you call warm vibrato. Is this something that you developed or thought about being a vocalist, or how did this come about, writing this?
I'm not sure it's related to singing for me, or related to being a vocalist, but I did play bass clarinet as a high schooler, and so I have a little bit of wind playing experience. And Uh, it's really more the presence of all these detailed vibrato markings in the piece really have more to do with wanting the music to be sort of at the cusp of uh, the audience asking sort of what's notated here. It goes back and forth between, for example, trills, just actually alternating between two notes, and then turning into sort of a very slow vibrato. And what I wanted it to feel like was as we kind of stay in these static chords for a long time, that we have this question of whether they're changing and how consistent they are. And I wanted it to be sort of on the brink where all the minute changes in timbre that you performers would naturally do. I wanted there to be kind of a fluid continuum between sort of incidental variation in sound to prescribed variation in sound, so that there would be this kind of middle territory where we're hearing vibrato levels change and the whole thing's just kind of shimmering. It also just goes along with this kind of image of the sun and this kind of shining, shimmering kind of quality.
All right. I think we have another question we want to cover.
Yeah, it looks like we have a few questions from Brian Baxter and from Luke Gillickson about the length of the piece. The first question is, did you originally set out to write a 30-minute piece of music for us? And there's another follow-up question to that. One of our audience members is interested in knowing, from a composer's standpoint, what the thought is on longer pieces in general. So maybe Erin, you might be able to speak to that too. Erin Rogers here, our tenor player, is a composer herself. So, but yeah, Ben, why don't you go ahead and answer that first?
Yeah, I definitely did not intend to write you guys a 30-minute piece. And I will just say for the record, it's very rare to work with a group when you tell them the piece is going to be 2 or 3 times longer than you planned, that they're totally fine with it. And New Thread was very obliging of this. But it actually came out of the speed of the piece. Notices these very slow tempo markings, kind of at the brink. Something like quarter note equals 47 or 57, where you can still count the pulse, but I wanted it sort of at the threshold of what is actually could be felt as a pulse. So when I started to kind of zoom into these slow tempi, the piece just doubled in length. And I also just, going along with the original idea to want it to be kind of unfiltered intuition, that that's just kind of what came out. But to the audience member's question, it's a really interesting question to kind of think about what does that mean to write a 30-minute piece for saxophones and ask an audience to sit and listen to that. And I can't say I have any answer to sort of why or why not that should be done, but I think that I do think that there are kind of interesting thresholds for us all as listeners. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the music on the radio is 3 to 5 minutes long consistently. And I don't think it's just about marketing it. I think it has to do with our thresholds for listening and what kind of amount is comfortable. And you notice in concerts where everyone coughs at the same time, or when everyone kind of shifts in their seat at the same time, I think there's kind of a collective unconscious there that's sort of guiding how you're hearing it. It has to do not only with total length, but also with harmony and pacing. I think you'll notice that I hope that this piece will actually feel a little shorter than 30 minutes. And because specifically it feels so slow and there's these sustains, listening to one chord for 20, 30 seconds is a lot different than listening to some fast, intense pop music for 30 seconds. So I think you'll notice that the time can kind of expand along with it, and I hope that the audience will follow me there. I appreciate them in advance.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, when you mentioned that this didn't mean to be 30 minutes long, and that you were obliged when we were or you were surprised that we were happy with it or okay with it. I think that it's a real, it's kind of an honor in a way to have a full-length piece like this, and I feel like as saxophonists, we should be okay playing full-length pieces. String quartets do it all the time. It's part of the canon of classical music. So to bring us into that realm in a way by including a very full-length important piece is really nice. It puts us, in that bracket. So I actually was really happy to hear it was 30 minutes.
Yeah, Aaron's. So maybe just a little historical piece of information about our quartet. Our name doesn't come from anything really profound. We used to write these email threads to each other, and it's a horrible organizational method to keep the same subject line as an ongoing thread for months and months, weeks, days at a time. And at some point, someone said, guys, can we please just start a new thread? And that's how our name came to pass. But we had a thread going about the length of the piece, and I think that, it was Aaron who wrote back, oh, I love long pieces. That was your reaction. So yeah, we're really pleased.
Can I actually ask you guys about how taxing is this? This piece is pretty intense, and some of it is very high in all of your registers. I'm wondering if you're kind of worried about performing a piece after it, or how much it must take a lot out of you.
Yeah, it's challenging endurance-wise. I think less so playing high and loud, but more these like long sustained chords that are very, very quiet. And it's not so much just endurance of the embouchure. It affects the way we're playing with our air. So playing so quietly for so long, we're not exhausting our lung supply. We have a buildup of bad air, CO2, and it's getting rid of this bad air, taking new air in. It can be, it almost makes you hyperventilate playing so slow and quiet. Almost counterintuitive. But yeah, that's probably the most challenging bit of the piece.
Circular breathing is very helpful in this. If that's a skill that those who are saxophone players who are listening in on this, for long sustained chords, slow, quiet passages, circular breathing can be very helpful for that.
Yeah. Maybe we should play a little bit.
Yeah, maybe like G to show some of these.
Oh, sure.
Start with that.
So, I turned the microphones up for talking, but we'll be a lot louder, so I'm not lower it back a little bit. Yeah, well, we're gonna play a part of Ben's piece Sunstruck, and I guess this is gonna be a little bit of section G, which is titled Dog Days, and it's one of these slow sections with long-held notes that Ben was referencing earlier. So where do you want to start from? Right on it, or?
Yeah, let's go right on it and maybe stop by 175 or thereabouts.
All right.
51.
151?
It's 51.
Oh, the tempo?
Yeah.
Ben Hjertmann Sunstruck.
Bravo, you guys. Thanks for playing that.
Yeah.
I
That's
think
actually a
I,
section that has some specified vibrato. So for me, half of that is specified as slow, unconscious, diaphragmatic vibrato. Sort of neat having that aspect controlled through chunks of the music.
Hopefully that is perceivable through the video and the internet and all that stuff.
Ben, can you tell us a little bit about that section and what it means, what you mean by dog days?
yeah, again, the titles are pretty eccentric. But you know, I mean, it was the dead of summer in Chapala, Mexico, where I was writing this, and it was, you know, 100 degrees, you know, the dog days of summer. So um, these were kind of the slow, sweaty chords of that time. But I think it's worth noting too about this section that you hear, the audience can probably hear that as you hear notes really close to one another, they do what we call beating or interference. So the notes that are close to each other, you kind of hear this shaking of the pitch, very subtle. Um, but it relates kind of directly to what I was trying to do with this vibrato, that we would hear when the notes are close together kind of naturally shaking pitch, and then as we come out of that to sort of clearer pitch, we have the performers kind of applying this shimmer to it. So I was kind of thinking about that relationship through this section especially.
All right.
So we're going to play a bigger chunk now?
Yeah, well, we have the microphones turned down. We're gonna play a little bit more. So from K.
K to O? Is that the?
Yeah, let's do that.
K to O.
And then the stuff right before O is silent.
Yeah, 6 bars.
357.
All right, so this is a later portion of Ben's piece, Sunstruck.
The title is, well, the name of this section is called Kids on Machine Gun Theme.
Starting in K, right?
We're in a K.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
So, Ben, that's actually some of the first times you've heard us play parts of the piece.
It's true.
How does it feel?
It feels great. I'm impressed, and that, like you say, that really quiet stuff is hard. And you heard them at the end fading out really beautifully to nothing. And there's an indication as I give them 7 bars of rest after that that they keep listening. And as we were talking about earlier in the chat, a lot of this piece has to do with this sound kind of coming and going, and that we keep listening through those silences afterward. Yeah, this is one of the most unexpected parts of the piece. With all of these fast 16th notes that we heard, it's sort of the manic side of the freedom that I was talking about earlier, trying to create something that we're not going to predict ahead of time. So as I was composing this, again, for those of you who are tuning in since I've said this, as I was composing this, I was trying not to start or stop myself from doing anything in the future of the piece. And so I had no idea before this moment at L, where they played these fast 16th notes, that I was going to do something like this. And again, there's kind of no rationale for it. There's no real way to say that this makes sense and works as a good piece of music. And yet there was something kind of strangely inevitable about it for me. Yeah, I'll pause for you guys to jump in. I'm going to try not to say too much here.
Earlier in the chat, you mentioned Myers-Briggs along with Terra and things like that. For those of you who are not familiar with that system, it's a 16 personality type indicator that was influenced by Carl Jung. So I take it, Ben, that you are in this compositional headspace that you're in, you're an intuitive rather than a sensory person.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. And I think to speak again to as it's kind of coming to me, I'm speaking again to these strange titles. And part of my idea with giving you all of these different markings that don't really relate to one another was to kind of try to show what the mental process was like writing this piece for me. And this Kids on Machine Gun Fame thing, I was watching some pretty terrible news updates at the time. And it was a kind of a way to try to say, instead of the music being constant and the music being something that exists outside of our personalities and what we experience as humans, to rather have that all be allowed in. And so everything from my taste in 90s music to these sort of shocking events in global culture, and also I had lost three people who are close to me in the time that I began this piece, and so they're all over this, including at one point in the piece you have an accented rest, and that's something that I learned from Lee Hyla, who was one of my favorite composition teachers, who passed away the same day that I left to Mexico to start writing this piece. So there are all these little kind of personal references to stuff outside of the piece and outside of music entirely. And again, none of it really makes sense, and it's sort of a question. And again, that's kind of partly the relationship with the tarot cards that we brought up, in that the way I see these is sort of, for better or worse, it's kind of an embracing or a giving value to chaos or randomness or just free choice from a deck. Sitting down at the piano and totally seeing what comes to you, regardless of what happened earlier in the piece. But to say one other thing about the section we just heard, if we don't mind, I was going to maybe ask Kristen to play one of these sections again. Actually, Jeff, would you mind playing 372? It's the quarter note 51, because I have a little comment about that. 372, it might be one bar off from that in your version. Thanks. So this is something that also was part of the interesting process of creating this. That little melody that you hear there happens several times in the piece, and the way that I did it was to continue to turn the pages forward as I was composing and not look back to what I had previously done. And yet this little motive kept kind of coming to mind, and it's sort of filtered by my memory in that you're hearing variations on it based on the fact that of the ways I remembered it, and I always remembered it a little bit differently. So that's a little bit of music that you hear come back throughout the piece.
All right. Okay. Another question for you, Ben, and maybe this is a nice way to kind of wrap things up in a little way. We know that Sunstruck is the second part of a cycle of 4 works that focus on different compositional techniques and approaches. You've received a Barlow Prize to create another sax quartet. Would that be the 3rd part then? And can you tell us more about the larger scale project?
Yeah, it's a very kind of personal cycle in that I want to create 4 pieces that focus not really on different musical elements, but on different approaches to composing. And so we said that Sunstruck is kind of the extreme of intuition. And the first sax quartet that I wrote, Mares of 33, was all about planning. And so it was all about planning out the form and structure ahead of time. In fact, I have a little YouTube video out there somewhere in which I spell out, as you listen to the piece, I spell out how I planned it ahead of time. So everything from register to harmony, etc. And I'm kind of seeing that that planning as sort of one extreme, and this intuitive process as one extreme. And the piece that I'm going to start, which will be the 3rd indeed in this set, will be focused on the details of playing. So it will be about me studying not necessarily extended techniques, but me trying to zoom inside the performer's breath, the performer's interface to creating music through these instruments. I have a little a little cheap Bundy saxophone in the closet over here that I'm going to get out for that. It's going to be totally focused on looking at it from a performer's point of view and thinking about how can we create drama and intensity and form from as it's derived from the process of playing the music. And I'll leave the 4th one a mystery for now because it's still mostly a mystery to me as well.
Reason we missed your question, we will scour our various social media pages and our email inboxes, and we'll certainly answer your question retroactively after this session.
You guys should definitely mention when the premiere is.
Oh, yeah.
1 week from today. So we'll be doing the premiere performance on next Sunday, September 28th at 5 p.m. It's going to be in Jersey City at St. Paul Lutheran Church. And if you want to find out all the detailed information, go to newthreadquartet.com and you'll see it right there. We'll also be videotaping the premiere and a pre-performance talk we'll do with Ben, and all that will be on YouTube. So you can check it out wherever you are in the world.
Not that that gives you an excuse to miss the event.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to hear this piece in that big resonant space and see how that affects all of our perceptions of the chords and the timing and the vibrato, etc.
Yeah, church space is going to be a lot of fun for this and the other rep we have planned.
Yeah.
Should be. It's always fun to play in church. I mean, it's just nice to performers. Cool. I think we can probably wrap it up there.
That's exactly 7 o'clock on our end. So thank you, Ben, so much for joining us and for writing us such an incredible piece of music.
Thanks to you guys. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks to New Music USA also for the support. It's really, really appreciated.
And thank
Absolutely.
you also to the audience who's tuning in.
Yes. So,
All right.
Check us out for the premiere next week. And if you missed it, we'll put a link below this video. You can go see it in, I don't know, 2 weeks from now, maybe. Whenever I edit the video.
All right. See you in a week in New Jersey.